welcome. I'm Marlon Bornett, Professor of Urban Planning, Director of the MetTrans Consortium, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our first 2022-2023 seminar in our series. We are set up to do this in hybrid format. So some of you are here in the room. Thank you. For those of you who are here, you are getting a free lunch. Don't let anyone tell you that there's no such thing as a free lunch. It's right here. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, thank you so much. And we are also set up to record, so we'll be able to post this to the MetTrans webpage later. Let me introduce Sue Dexter, our presenter today. Sue has done fantastic work here in our PhD program. Sue, are you a fourth year or fifth year PhD student?
I'm sixth year.
Okay, Sue is in the PhD program. Just starting your sixth year.
Yes.
In the Urban Planning and Development PhD program. And where she will be presenting to us on Cradle-To-Grave lifecycle assessment of zero-emission heavy-duty trucks as part of your dissertation.
Yes.
And it's incredibly important work. She is well into that. Sue spent 27 years working for Toyota in logistics before she came back to our PhD program. So she brings substantial experience with the private sector before doing this scholarship. And as you'll see in what she's working on, that link is very important. Also, I've had a chance to see this work some beforehand. It's very good, very important, very interesting. Normally, I try to prep up a little bit more in introductions, but I wasn't able to do it because we're on a live mic. So my usual MO is I ask the speaker, tell me things about yourself, but everyone would have heard that. So know that Sue Dexter is fantastic. This is important work. Thank you so much. Sue, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really happy to be here today to share this information with you. And been working on this for a while, and I am gotten in a very good place to share some of my results with you. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is what I see on my daily commute. And if anybody lives in the Los Angeles area, we all know that there are tons and tons of heavy duty trucks moving cargo around, especially from the ports to and from the ports of LA and Long Beach. It's estimated that there's about 27,000 containers a day that is coming into both of the ports. And 70% of that is actually trucked out of the port. 30% goes by rail right now. So there's a lot of traffic on the freeways, and meaning that there's a lot of externalities from these trucks too. So in working with Toyota, and trying to green their supply chain, one of the things that I was really interested in was how do we move forward without impacting the economic viability of the region and the global economy, but to reduce the carbon footprint for urban freight, specifically for these big trucks. So that was really my motivation for looking at this. I just want to introduce a few things quickly so you can get a background on how severe the situation is as far as it goes. Now, when we talk about energy consumption in the US, you can see these are the feedstocks that come into making our energy. A lot of it comes from fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, petroleum. So these are very polluting in their own right. This is our problem with our climate change issue and all of that. So you can see here in transportation that the majority of the energy used in the US, 27%, is 24% of that comes from petroleum. Now, this is for transportation as a whole. This includes passenger transportation, freight transportation, air, rail, the whole gambit. Okay, so it's not actually split out in that way, but quite a bit. So then when we actually look at the greenhouse gas effect of this, it's very similar. So the energy is highly corresponding to the transportation at 27%. But if we blow out that pie for the greenhouse gas in the US emissions, you can see that 26% of that 27% is medium and heavy duty trucks. So that's your freight trucks, right? And medium duty trucks are more like your FedEx or your UPS delivery trucks, your very smaller ones. And then the heavy duty trucks are considered a class 7, 8, and above, which is also those big cargo trucks, the big grocery trucks you see moving foodstuffs around, all that, plus refuse trucks and those because they're very heavy vehicles. They do a lot of work, right? So the bad news here is that this transportation and especially medium and heavy duty trucks, greenhouse gases are increasing. And if we don't do anything about it by 2040, they're expected to use 40% more fuel. So if we don't do something, we're going to be in a worse situation than we are now with the greenhouse gas situation. So a little bit more about this. In emissions from freight modes, so you can see the bottom one here. This is for all of our nasties, right? This is for our NOx and our PM, our particulate matter, and all these other types of carbon dioxide is at the top, you can see. So for road is heavily polluting on a per gram ton kilometer. So, and then, rail, short sea shipping and ocean shipping don't nearly as pollute as much on a per kilogram basis. Another way to look at this too is distance traveled for 1 ton of cargo using 1 kilowatt of energy. So you can see here that ships, they are pretty efficient when it comes to that, even though they are using fossil fuels to power themselves. And then you have rail, and then you have the heavy truck. And of course, planes are very, very carbon intensive, right? So really interesting about this. So this is just to put it all in context of why that this is a big issue, because trucks, they're not very efficient for energy usage as it is, and it pollutes quite a bit. I love CalEnviroScreen, and if you guys haven't accessed this tool, it's not just for the Los Angeles and Skag region, it's for all of California. And you can pick different pollutants and also information about health impacts as well. And this is for diesel particulate matter, but all of them pretty much look like this. If you look down at the very bottom there, you can see the Long Beach port, that big area down on the peninsula. And that has just, is the worst diesel PM ever. And they've cleaned it up a lot. And the ports have done a great job of mitigating a lot of the pollution in this area. But you can see and you can follow the freeways, right? Where the trucks travel is where the diesel PM is. It's really not any shocker, but this just basically, confirms that. You have your downtown LA here. You have your 710. This is the 110. This is 710. You have your Hobart intermodal train station here. Over here, you have LAX. So big transportation centers. And then you have it going out to the Inland Empire. And then this is the 5 freeway going down to San Diego. So especially because the trucks go through areas that potentially have, folks who are economically disadvantaged, they are impacted much more from the local pollutants that these trucks have. So that's also an issue. So I don't want to just say that it's a global GHG issue. It's also a local emissions issue as well. So California has really made a lot of mandates, executive orders, looking at how we can mitigate some of these things. And they're really putting a lot of effort into EV trucks, electric vehicle trucks. So by 2045, they want 100% that are being sold to be zero emission. Zero emission is just not electric. It's also some other technologies, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then starting in 2024, there's a percentage that has to be sold year over year by the by the manufacturers to reach climate change goals for California. Okay, so all retail electricity sales are supposed to be renewable and zero carbon by 2045. And also there are rulings about increasing freight efficiencies as well. So I started looking at all these things and I said to myself, especially because California is really putting a lot of effort and money into the demonstrations of electric vehicles, heavy duty trucks, is this truck superior from a life cycle perspective? And I'll define what life cycle is in a minute. But especially when I started here 5-6 years ago, there was so much talk about tailpipe emissions. And of course, electric vehicles don't have tailpipe emissions, but that's not the whole story, right? The whole story is you have to plug that puppy in. And when you do that, you have emissions from the electricity generation power plant. So if you're on a dirty grid, you are going to be polluting that particular area. It just is not on those freeways like we saw with the Cal EnviroScreen. It's going to be where the power plant is. California is pretty clean, though, compared to a lot of other places. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So hence life cycle analysis. And when life cycle analysis is really important because for our climate change issue, we make things all over the world now. And as we talk about supply chains and we make something someplace, then we transport it someplace else. We put it into a component, which is then sent someplace else and put it in another component, and the supply chain goes on, right? So really looking at a spatial problem and a problem of all the externalities in that manufacturing supply chain, with the transportation and with the handling and all that. So you can see this life cycle stages. And first of them is the extraction, the actual mining of the minerals for the component parts. Then you actually manufacture them, and you do it in several stages, usually in different places. And transportation, conveyance around the globe for some of these things. You also have to construct the infrastructure for these types of vehicles. You have to maintain the vehicles. And then you also have to, you're selling them, you're using the vehicles, you're then at the end of life. Hopefully you're recycling or you're refurbishing or you're doing something with them. So you're not putting it in the landfill, but sometimes you are doing that. So, but what's really important here is we can look at so many different things, right? We can look at products. We can see then where in the life cycle is the heaviest use of carbon or water or energy. And maybe then look at the components of that and say, how can we do this better? How can we lower our footprint? It's very powerful tools that are gaining a lot of acceptance lately. And so, everybody in the supply chain has a part to play. And they can start to see their impacts on their products and what they do. Also, providing information to consumers and driving consumers to also demand that their products be have lower carbon footprints. I love it. Some of these websites now you can actually see, like for a pair of shoes, what is the carbon footprint for that product, and that helps me drive my decisions anyway. So hoping that gains more traction. So that's briefly what life cycle analysis is all about. So now to my research question. So I wanted to not only look at electric heavy duty trucks, I also wanted to look at hydrogen heavy duty trucks, which we call fuel cell vehicles, FCV. So when you see that on my presentation, you'll see that. And I wanted to look at all of the life cycle impacts of that from the EV trucks have these big batteries, right? Through every single phase, through the use phase, the fuel cycle phase, and to the retirement of that vehicle. So originally, I was going to focus on the components that were different between the different models, but then I also looked at the whole vehicle itself because of the tools that I have. My functional unit is 1 mile driven. I am assuming that 1 mile is equivalent in each of these. They are not, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So my main assumptions is that I have Class 8 trucks. I have a typical diesel truck I'm going to compare it to. I'm also comparing it to a 300-mile range electric vehicle and a hydrogen vehicle. Now, the hydrogen trucks right now, no problem with that mileage. We're good. That's a real stretch for the electric vehicles. Right now, the Generation 1 heavy-duty trucks are getting around 135, 140 miles between charges, which is a whole lot less than a diesel truck, a whole lot less. So you have to be charging it all the time. But the next generation, at least what I've heard from Volvo in their next generation VNRs is 200 plus. So that's good news. But the Tesla Semi, Elon Musk, if we believe what he says, he's going to be putting out a truck, one of these big trucks. You see it here. It's the top picture at a 300-mile range and a 500-mile range. But as you go up, those batteries start weighing more. As you weigh more, you get to carry less cargo. So there's a trade-off there, right? So anyway, I'm going to compare a Kenworth Toyota T680 with the Kenworth T680 diesel. So Toyota has teamed up with Kenworth to do some demonstrations on a hydrogen truck utilizing their Mirai technology hydrogen vehicles. And then Tesla is out there, but they've been running a lot of tests. People have seen the vehicle on the roads hauling Tesla type of products around, but they haven't let a lot of this information out. So I had to get creative on how I was going to figure out how to model this stuff. But I wanted to let you guys know that there's this great website by, it's called Drive to Zero, and CalSTART was the impetus for this. There's a consortium of folks out there, and it's for looking to see what vehicles are available right now for firms or fleets or governments or anybody who's interested in looking at these vehicles. You can select fuel type here, electric or fuel cell, select a platform, select a manufacturer if you want, or you can see all the manufacturer. It's not just for the US, it's for Europe, China, India, and Latin America. So it is global, and it is where you can get these products right now. So they're updating this all the time because this is changing very quickly. So check that out. I won't be doing any more than that with this, but check that out. So when we start looking at heavy-duty truck powertrain comparisons, the one thing that I want to point out is, diesel is still going to be the best in the short term for some things, right? The acquisition dollars cost between $120,000, $130,000. Your electric vehicles are costing, hold on to your seats, $300,000. And the fuel cell vehicles really aren't on the market yet, so we don't know how much those are going to cost. So, it's something to think about, right? And the infrastructure. We have the infrastructure for the diesel, but we're going to have to build a lot more infrastructure, especially in yards and those things to plug in trucks, or we don't have any public truck charging stations, although they're just putting in one through California is just putting in one through to connect Southern and Northern California. So that's also with hydrogen. So that's fabulous. So refueling time, you can fill up a diesel truck in 9 minutes. You can fill up a hydrogen truck in 16 minutes. But for electric, it takes 4 to 8 hours, unless you're doing quick charge. If you do quick charge, you're not going to get it all the way to get your full mileage, but it's a good little oomph to get you home. However, it degrades the battery. So you're going to decrease your battery life. So they're working on ways to make that. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of put that out there and say there's some good and bad things, right, about this. It's not all gravy. So the first thing I had to do was I had to define my system boundaries for my study and say, what am I actually going to study? So I already talked about the life cycle stuff. So here, starting on the far left, these are our mining, are getting our natural resources to make all this stuff, especially the batteries. And then you move to the manufacturing for the components and all that through that. And then you have to distribute it. That's the one in the middle. So you have to get it to those dealerships or to the customer. And then you have the use phase. And this is here. So this is a product use, but you also you get your fueling for this. So here, this is just showing for BET and FCTs, fuel cell trucks and battery electric trucks. But, hydrogen production has a lot of nasties that come into it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But also, your electric grid for the battery charging and stuff like that. And then your end of life. So you can see. So one of the things I am not looking at is the infrastructure for this. Like I said, that there's not infrastructure for the hydrogen. There's really not infrastructure for the electric charging. That's a whole nother ball of wax, right? So that is intentionally not included because I thought diesel would really win out because we don't have to build anything for that, unless I would say that didn't exist either. So that was my rationale between that. So I settled on a tool to use by Argonne National Library. And they really do provide the tools, a gold standard for vehicle emission modeling. And there's the two tools that I use. It's called AFLEET, which is Alternative Fuel Lifecycle, Environmental and Economic Transportation. So we'll go with AFLEET, okay? And then GREET, which is the Greenhouse Gases Regulated Emissions and Energy Use and Technologies tools. They model different parts of the life cycle, and then you have to integrate it in together. They just came out with a tool. I was in training for the last 2 days for GREET 2022. And they have now a GREET 1 and GREET 2, which interconnect with each other. So you can now model it under one platform. So now I have to make the decision of whether I go back through and I redo my analysis to see how or if I get different results. I don't know. I spent a long time doing this. I want to, we'll see. So anyway, you can see, I won't go into all the details on that, but if you're interested, go to Argonne National Labs websites. This is a free tool. You can download it and anybody can use it, but it's complicated. So the process I went through was I had to do an inventory analysis. So what are these trucks made of? How heavy are these things? So, because I had to model them, right? I used AFLEET to do the well to pump, which is the fuel cycle, and the pump to wheel, which is the use cycle for these trucks. And then I used GREET, which is a passenger vehicle app specifically for the 2020 model that I used. And that was from the mining through the distribution, plus recycling and disposal, okay? And for that, because as a passenger, I had to factor up cars to trucks. And I'll show you how I did that in a second. So then I had to synthesize and normalize and all of that. And my next phase really is to do a lot of sensitivity analysis. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I mentioned these batteries are big. How big are they? They're really big. There's estimates between that they are 5,000 to 11,000 plus pounds for these batteries. So if we look at our regular container truck that's taking our stuff from the ports, we have an 80,000 pound limit for those vehicles. That includes both the truck, chassis, and the load that they're carrying. So if you are going to take away 10,000 pounds of that, you have less load that you can carry, right? So that's an issue. But one of the things that I was really interested about when I started looking at this was, what about supply chain issues with these things? These are rare minerals that are included in this, like cobalt, which is in a lithium iron cell. I think it's 69% of all of the minerals come from the DNC in Africa, and it's precarious at best. There are some particular, like lithium, a lot of the production is done in South America and also in Australia. We don't really have a lot of lithium being made here. We stopped our mining, right? We outsourced our mining. So now that there is really a push to bring that back, and guess what? Because the future of the automotive and trucking industry is this direction, that there are a lot of manufacturers which are partnering up and investing in mines, because they know that if they can't get access to these particular components, then they're not going to be able to make their vehicles. So that's very interesting in its own right. Anyway, I'm not going to go into what all this stuff is, but there's graphite, there's nickel, cobalt, manganese. Some of these are just really nasty. And mining these things takes a whole lot of energy. It's one of the dirtiest things that you can do is to mine this stuff, because you have to dig up a whole bunch of stuff, and then you have to separate out the stuff that you want. And so you get a little bit from digging up a whole bunch. The lithium they make in brine pools, but they do have an oring process. The brine pools are mostly in South America, whereas the ore is being done in Australia. Anyway, but there's a lot of research. Like I said, we want to make them so they're lighter. We want to increase their density so they go farther, and we want them to get faster charging. So there's tons of different types of batteries and all of that. In my analysis, I used the most common one, the one that is being used by Tesla. So this is what I had to do. Don't dig too deep, but I just wanted to show you what I actually had to do. So I had a diesel truck that was the Kenworth T680, right? And then I had an EV, and then I had the fuel cell model. Oh, I hate it when I do that. When I touch the screen, things happen. I have to remember not to do that. So what I did is I used the Model S Tesla, and I factored up stuff. And then the Mirai from Toyota, and I factored that up. So what I did was, so we have the car and then all that. So we have the Tesla Model S. The vehicle weight is less than 5,000 pounds. The battery in that is 1,200 pounds. So a lot of that car is that battery. Interesting. It has some motors and power converters and other things like that. Now we come to the Tesla Semi. Now there's not a lot of information on this because it's being held very close to the vest. But looking at what all the experts have to say, I came down to this wonderful, really round number of 26,909 pounds. That includes the battery of the one that I'm looking at for 5622 here, 5,622, but it has 4 motors. So then I had to factor some things up. How much more does this weigh? It weighs 5.6 times more. The actual battery is 5.8 times more. So I'm thinking that in a perfect world, and now you have to model things, right? What I did is I took the passenger vehicle component parts, component by component for these cars, and I factored them up accordingly. And if I didn't have anything, I used the overall weight as a measure. Same thing with the fuel cell vehicle. Not a lot of information out there about that vehicle, but then the fuel tanks, they're really big at a factor of 10. But I didn't want to use a factor of 10. That seemed crazy to me. Although I have heard that it is crazy energy intensive to make these things. So maybe using a factor of 10 wasn't so crazy after all, but I didn't use that. So again, we would love for this all to be science. There's a lot of art that has to be done to model these things. The results that people get are different based upon the inputs that they have. So you have to be very thoughtful on what you're using and all of that. So anyway, just to give you a little bit of a flavor about what that nightmare was all about. And then some other model inputs, the Argonne tools, you can pick your grid. And so I picked the West Coast grid for this, but you can then do it from a locational perspective or spatial perspective. And so the one that was in the 2020 was the 2019 Western grid. And you can still see it's got some fossil fuels in it, 31%, coal 17%, nuclear 8%, hydroelectric 26%, pretty good, wind 7%, solar 6.5%. So they have updated this now. I have 2021 data. So that's great. Anyway, so we want to be able to, for the EV to see how polluting that grid is, right? For that. And now we have to have a little talk about hydrogen. All the colors of hydrogen, aren't they pretty? They're so pretty, but they mean different things. Green, of course, is your best. That's just from renewable energy. To make hydrogen, you have to use power to do that. So most, and when I say most, I'm talking about plus 95% or even higher of hydrogen being made right now is utilizing gray, black, and brown. And so gray, the steam methane reforming or SMR process is your most common. And so that's using natural gas, right? Fossil fuel, not great. So when we think about it and everybody's like, hydrogen, tailpipe emissions, what do you get out of it? You get some water vapor that comes out the back. Great. But if you're making, it's the same with the grid. How clean is how you're producing hydrogen will mean how polluting that use cycle is and the fuel cycle. So we want to be able to get to green, or at least if we're going to use fossil fuels, we want to do CO capture and reuse it for something else using nuclear power. I like it purple pink. I wonder how they came up with that. I don't know. The white is a byproduct of an industrial process. So at least you're taking waste and you're using it instead of throwing it away. So there's some other things here, but this is where we want to be, right? That's where we want to be. So what happened when I put all this stuff into this jumbled pot? And let me tell you, there's over 90 Excel tabs that are all interrelated in these tools. Yay. And following things all the way through and making sure you understand it and you're not like making some terrible decisions. I came out with this. At first, I only did the SMR because that's what we're using right now. And look what happened. My fuel cell truck is worse than a diesel truck using SMR. I cried. And this was no surprise, actually. The EV was less than diesel. You can't see very well on this. Maybe if you're looking at your computer screen, you can see it better, but how it's projected up here. So this is the vehicle cycle here. And then this is the operation. So vehicle cycle, what does that mean? That means the mining, the manufacturing, all that, right? And then the ops fuel cycle, that's the use cycle and actually making the fuel. So that's your long bars here, right? And then the battery recycling, it's a little itty bitty thing because they don't do a good job about that right now. They are not recycling. They know they have to, but it's very complicated, right? Especially when you embed all this stuff together, you actually have to modularize how you're making things to be able to take it apart and reuse it again. So there has to be a lot more thought into how it's being made in the first place to dismantle it and reuse. Anyway, so when I originally ran this and I cried, I said, all right, let's look at some other ways of doing this. And so I looked at doing electrolysis using solar, and it's good. It's good. But that's your green, right? That's your green. This is your gray. And that is the difference here. So you can see how impactful it is for that particular process. So that's for CO2 emissions. So let's look at energy. So here's the energy life cycle. And again, I have the same three bits here. And you can see when you look at energy, though, diesel is like out of the charts. And in this, even the SMR actually beat out EV. Interesting results, I thought. Let's look at some of the emissions here. So the diesel is in blue, the EV is in orange, the fuel cell is in gray, and then which is SMR gray, and then the green, I intentionally picked those, right? Green was for the green solar hydrogen mix. So you can see that we have really high CO and NOx for diesel. Again, not a huge surprise. I was pretty much surprised, though, that the SOx was so high for EVs. So could be grid issues. Again, I was using that Western grid. So really the next part that you have to do in this is you have to normalize. When I talk about normalization, I want to look at not only from a perspective of the CO2 emissions or energy, but I want to look at some of the other baddies, I'll say, for these processes, right? So you have resource depletion, you have acidification, you have ozone formation, you have these types of things. So we have their impact factor based upon those results that we got, and then factoring and using what's standard. I could then compare diesel, EV, and the fuel cell. Here I'm presenting the SMR, and you can definitely see that it's from a perspective of all those climate change things put together, it is by far the worst. But that didn't surprise me either with what we had. But to put things in context, over the lifetime of the vehicle, this is like 46,000 miles, 10 years for this, you can see that the pounds of CO2, wherever it comes from, the SMR is the most when we look at that. And then for the diesel is for total energy barrels. But we already saw that, but it's just amping up. So for one truck, it's going to use 1,912 barrels of oil in its lifespan. That's a lot of oil, but it's very, very, the energy here, and energy is, we're talking any types of petrol equivalent. So the gas and everything is put into that as a petrol equivalent. There's the tools that you can do to make that transition happen. So what were the limitations I had? I just didn't have a lot of information. So I had to gather and make good decisions based upon where the source of the information was coming from and make some of those decisions. And I was talking about one diesel truck or one EV truck does not equal the cargo capacity of one diesel truck. So if you're really going to look at the life cycle here, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to look at that issue. So if you wanted to haul so much loads, tonnage, what do you actually need? Because then that is going to amp up the EV because you're going to need more capacity to do that, right? So it's really not a 1-for-1 because of the weight and the load capacity issue. Then the tools are fantastic. A lot of information is there. Too much actually is overwhelming, but it still is kind of a black box. You could totally customize your inputs. If you wanted to say that I'm getting all my cobalt from some other country because I got a deal with them and they have it, you could put that in there and it will calculate all of that for that country. It's very cool. But you don't really know a lot of times where they're getting their information from too. I mean, this Argonne is funded by the Department of Energy and some other groups. So this is what they do in this group. So this is their whole game in life. And if you want to know those kinds of things, you can write to them and you can ask them and they'll respond to you, which is really great. And I've had some conversations with the developers of this tool, and I'm very grateful to them. But their manual and user guides, they're not so great. And so going to training is really helpful, of which I did the last 2 days. I already talked about the recycling is in shambles, but that doesn't have anything to do with the tool. That has to do with the real life situation that's happening right now. There is a huge recycling of these batteries that is being developed, a plant in Norway. And so hopefully, because they've been able to figure out how to do this, they'll be able to share that information. Anyway, so the one thing, though, that I haven't talked about and that the tool does give me is water. Like, how much water do you use? Hydrogen is made with water. So what does that mean then also, as far as if you're in a very drought area? You can't use like gray water. I don't think you have to have it clean like drinking water, but you can't use like wastewater to make your hydrogen with that. So it's something to think about also. And I have some maps if you're interested about that. Again, I didn't include the infrastructure. I think it's an interesting issue, something that needs to be looked at. But, really the results show that to make the fuel cell trucks viable option, we need to do the renewable. And, we need to do that. There's companies now that are building, but it's going to take a while for these things to come online, right? Shell is working on a plant in Germany, a power plug here in the United States, Bloom Energy too, I think worldwide for them. Also, there is a race from the DOE to entice hydrogen producers to get more economies of scale and lower the price. Right now, it's $5 per kilogram. That's a lot of money. And to really make it a parity, needs to go down to $1. That's huge. That's huge. So there's a lot of work to be done, lots of homework. So my next steps is to update with the new tool. I want to look at natural gas trucks also. don't know about infrastructure, or that's something that I'll do at a future state. And then I want to do a lot of sensitivity analysis. And I have the data in the tools that I have right now to do this. Like, what about this grid? What about that? What about if you get to be more renewable grid quicker? The tools actually have a forecast out through 2045. So you can look at that per area. Look at the phase breakdown, really start to look at those particular components, which are very heavily energy and carbon intensive. You know, they are switching, or they're trying to do mining in the United States. That's bringing it all back to the US again, changing that whole mindset from offshoring to nearshoring. So those things are not in the tool, but I can customize that if I want to. Also looking at different battery compositions. There's handfuls of them. There's a bunch of them. So maybe that makes a difference too. And you can just click on it and it will automatically change it. It will change all that configuration below for you. So, and again, adjusting for my freight load. So that's where I'm at right now. Still a lot of work to be done. And that's a 710 freeway on the way to the port, which I took out of my car, and I probably shouldn't have because I was driving, right? But it really is the commute that I see and I love and all of that. There you go. Questions?
What would it take to get to the green hydrogen? You know, the electrolysis from water with renewable energy. I know that's a big question.
It is a big question, but you know, wind. You know, you would hope that it would be hydroelectric power. In certain places, that's not realistic much anymore. You know, as a matter of fact, like in Tanzania has been developing a lot of hydroelectric power, and now year over year they're down 70% in their water supply, so they can't get any of their, and so they've had to, you know, fuel coal into their coal power plants. So it's.
What are the water supply ramifications? You mentioned that briefly. We can't use gray water for this, you mentioned?
No.
What
Let
about
me show you.
Recycled, desal, other sources?
So this is from Argonne, and this is from their tool. So you can see the orange bits here. Those are the places where you're not going to want to make hydrogen. And it's not a good area to make them because there's water supply issues. And that's current. I think they also have some forecasts and stuff like that too, but I think that it's very interesting. Of course, we have California, and we have some of that happening here too, and some other places who are getting to be more water scarce. So, and this is just the United States. Like to look at this from a world perspective also, you know, you hear a lot about that. Did I answer your first question, Marlon?
Yeah. Could you make it off of some of the really expensive technologies like desalination?
Probably, yes. Yeah, it's all about the money.
Expensive. Yeah.
And the time lag too. You know, when we start saying, you know, California says by 2024, you have to start selling all of this, you know, to the manufacturers. Right now, they have incentives to help people get into these vehicles because of the fact that they're so expensive, right? I mean, who can afford more than double or 3 times the cost of a new diesel truck? So there's a lot of incentives. Does it make up for everything? No, it doesn't. But it sure helps. Those incentives are not going to last forever. The government can't pay for all this stuff, right? But they're going to have to help in the infrastructure business and all that. What about our grids? You know, people say, can our electric grid, can it handle all the cars that we're going to need and all these freights? What happens during a brownout? How do you charge your vehicles? This is a hard sell for fleets. If they can't move their loads because they can't charge up because there might be an electrical brownout because of some that's a hard pill for them to swallow. So there's a lot of operational things that with these vehicles as well. And we're talking a lot about those.
Thank you. Hi, Stu. It's Patty. Long time no see.
Hi.
Hi. Couple questions. The diesel fuel that you used in your analysis, is that California's CARB standard? Is that the national standard?
That's a great question. It would be the California standard because that's where I drew it from.
Okay.
Because I'm pretending like I'm here and doing it. So again, that might the diesel might change depending on the area that you are, just like the grid, right? Wherever you're going or wherever you're saying you're using that particular vehicle, where exactly. So
Okay, we have a low sulfur diesel here. So in California, we have renewable diesel that is coming along, and that is thanks to our low carbon fuel standard in California. And the market for renewable diesel in California is being encouraged quite a bit by CARB and so forth, because it's a drop-in fuel and it's about 80% cleaner. And so I was just curious, I noticed you had a next step to your analysis. Would you be looking at the renewable diesel that is coming online with the refineries?
Well, I'm happy to say the new 2022 GREET tools do include renewable diesel. So I will have that opportunity to look at that. So I would like to do that. Time dependent, but I think it's important to look at, and you're 100% correct. So thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Robert.
Yeah. While you were speaking about towards the beginning about the power grid, the electric grid, and how that could be just as dirty as these trucks, it seems like right now in policy the push is on both ends, but it seems like we're discussing more about zero-emission electric vehicles. And so I was thinking about like Sella, for example, where they're going to benefit, people in Southeast LA are going to benefit from reduced tailpipe emissions, but then the area that's close to a power plant is going to suffer in the short term amongst that same kind of thing. And so I guess like the equity issues that are there are really interesting to consider. And I guess it's more of a comment, but I guess it's kind of opening the door on like more like existential like problems of like when Marlon mentioned where you might want to draw water from, for example, like I can imagine like the state of Michigan being like, no one's touching our water. We don't want to do that. And so there's all these like different trade-offs, like larger trade-offs. And so I would love to almost like see a trade-off panel like in your final research that is similar to the tool that they had for the vehicles. Like where you could pick a vehicle type and manufacturer, like just kind of considering like an up and down like trade-off thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying because of the fact that, I mean, just look at the US used to do a lot of mining for a lot of things. Then we shut that down.
And now we have West Virginia.
Exported it to other places because we didn't want the environmental impacts. We didn't want the pollution that was associated with it. But it doesn't go away. And as a matter of fact, if you're in a place that has dirtier standards, then they don't, what's going up into our atmosphere could be worse. Plus, then you're actually shipping it all the way across the seas, right? So there's a local problem, there's a regional problem, and there's a global problem.
Yeah, and as someone who's like really like obviously concerned about these issues, but also with a relationship to like the American auto industry, like through everyone in my family, basically, it's really like I'm always like, yay, go California for like basically like strong arming the auto companies into like these higher standards. But at the same time, you might consider the fact that like that policy is great for California, but it might make another area of the country or even areas in California suffer like from equitable issues. So yeah, it's wild.
Yep. I mean, would you want to produce a truck closer to the market and in a cleaner place also? Because that would, and your component parts and all that other kind of stuff, if you're only looking at the greater good,
right? Right. That policy is dependent on like manufacturing states that are generally less likely to have these types of policies to produce greener energy.
Right. And it takes a long time to develop that industry or to bring it back. So anyway, it's interesting questions. A lot of policy related issues revolving around this topic.
Sue, there's also a represented labor component to that. Not only is it, we don't want to be leakage, with our exporting our pollution, but there's also here, we have more represented labor and our safety standards are the highest.
Yes, exactly right. I totally agree. Thank you.
First of all, I loved your presentation. It was super impressive. And I was just wondering, what challenges did you face when you were trying to put everything together, the research and all of it. What was like the biggest challenge for you in the whole process?
Her question was, what challenges did I face when I was putting this together? What was the biggest challenge? And I think there are really two of them. One was, it wasn't like I could just look up and say, oh, look, for this vehicle, they have all the information. And so that took me a long time to figure out how I was going to model that. You know, I didn't really understand that when I first took it on. And the second thing was the learning curve for the tools. It's long and it's laborious, and you have to be patient and you have to follow the stuff through, because you could do something that would be, it's kind of like you can put in a few things and run the tool and get some output out. And that's so dangerous. And it's so dangerous because you just don't know what you're really doing. And if you don't understand what's happening, I think people could be making some bad decisions based upon the information that they're getting out of the tool, because they're actually not using it to the depth of what you need to do. You know, so those are the two things. So now I get to learn a whole new tool. Yay! But I like it. It's good, but I have to go into my little Excel bubble for a long time and get in that mindset, right? Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with this company. It's called Proterra. They're a California company, and they are trying to make batteries smaller. And I was just curious if you have looked into the viability of that and what that might look like in the future, and how that will impact your research.
So it's miniaturizing the components. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, making more compact.
Well, I mean, that's something that we really have to do, right? Because as soon as we can get more efficient, density for energy output for that, less weight and everything, that will hopefully even bring down the cost more too. So it will make it, I mean, these batteries for these vehicles are hugely expensive. That's why the price is so high, right? I mean, we're talking about the trucks are basically the same. Well, not exactly. You have to put in some other stuff for it, but a tire is a tire, right? A cab is a cab. It doesn't have anything that's specifically different for that. So that's important. And there is so much work going on right now with batteries, because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You know, if everybody goes to all EV vehicles, I mean, this is our future, really. And even the fuel cell vehicles, I failed to mention this, they do have a lithium ion battery in it. It's not like this big puppy that's in the EV, but they do actually have a much, not your regular battery that you're going to see if you lift up the hood. So, but not nearly to the scale. So it's important for both of these technologies. There you go.